Hello and welcome to the Creating a Physics Prop tutorial. This is a long-form tutorial intended for those who have little to no previous experience with 3D modeling. Over the course of the video, you will learn how and where to find the software you need to create a prop. You'll learn how to use the Blender UI and its various basic controls, how to export the files from Blender, how to write a QC file, how to compile a QC file into a model, and the various troubleshooting tips, how to write a VMT file and import textures into VTFEdit, as well as the brief section on using Substance Painter or exporting textures from Blender. While this video is intended for complete beginners, familiarity with Blender, Hammer, or Photoshop will benefit you greatly. If you haven't used any of those in a while or at all, you consider watching tutorials on that software as well. So right off the bat, Google is your most powerful tool, but it is a very old system we're using here, so it may not always be easy to find your answers, so you can always go to Discords and various discussion boards to look for answers as well. Blender, I'm going to use the latest version of Blender, or at least a latest version. I think I'm on 3.0. This is what that website looks like. Another tool you're going to need is Crowbar. Crowbar is kind of like a one-stop shop for various things. You can use it for all different source engine games, but for our purposes it'll be for compiling the model itself to be used in a game. Not necessary, but suggested is to get Notepad++. I will be using it for this tutorial, if only for the simple reason that I have a user-defined language, which is available on ModDB. As this preview could show you, by default the QC files that you author or decompile will be kind of hard to read. It'll all just be black text on white. User-defined language in Notepad++ makes that a little more readable, adds colors. It's got all the predefined terms built in for the most part, so you can tell if you're spelling things correctly. That way you know if your errors are syntax related or just not working. Another tool you'll need is VTFEdit. This is how you'll create material files and import textures into the necessary engine. This is an archive of NEMS tools, but if you also just look up VTFEdit, there should be a long list of places where you can get this. A tool I use a lot, simply because I use Photoshop, is Super PNG. For whatever reason, Photoshop does not like to export PNG files with the proper transparency, or at least a transparency that we can use for VTFEdit. So this will allow you to designate a separate channel that you've created in Photoshop as the transparency channel, so that color data isn't lost when you're authoring a texture. And last but not least, Substance Painter. It's available on Steam right now. Otherwise, there's a subscription. I know it's got a pretty hefty price tag, but believe me, it's changed my life. And if you get it, it probably will yours too, if you're into 3D modeling. And we'll cover that a little bit later on down the line. One final file you'll need to do this properly is the Blender source tools. As you can see on this website, just look up on Google Blender source tools. This will probably be the first result. As it says, you need Blender 2.9 or later. Download the file. It'll be a zip file. Just leave it as a zip, put it somewhere, and then we'll go from there. So, as you can see on this desktop here, I've got the Crowbar directory. I've got the source tools. This is a QC file. We'll deal with that later. So, to start, we'll open Blender. Alright, so on this main screen, it kind of looks a little strange. Some basic things you'll want to know about how to use Blender before we even get into installing files and stuff is that it's kind of like, how would I put this? It's a bit like Hammer. It's a bit like Excel. Basically, what you're looking at is a couple of viewports. This main one right here, where the 3D models go, is just a viewport. You don't even have to have this on if you don't want. Same thing with this properties bar over here. Same thing in this outline bar up here. So easiest way to demonstrate this is that you can drag these things out. You can change their orientations, but also if you go up to the top right corner of any box, you can start dragging down and create new viewports and new dialog boxes. And if you line up just right, you can have one go from one to the other and consume it basically. So if you don't want the outliner, you can just combine windows until you've got one left. Drag from the top right. So now all we've got is a 3D viewport and a timeline at the bottom and a small properties window. Keep dragging. Now we just have a timeline window. So then, up here in this top left part of the screen, this little clock, this will appear on everything. This is how you can change between the various modes that this current cell, this whole cell is in. So that's how you can have your classic 3/4 view of top left, bottom right orthogonal if you so choose when you're modeling. Usually I just use the default, but so right now you can manipulate each of these windows to have a different perspective. And for reference, I'm using the middle mouse button and dragging to rotate and pan around here. But as well, this gizmo in the top left, you can click on these actual letters and change which orientation they're in. You can also just click and drag on it with the left mouse button. Anyways, just good to know, because up here on the top you may accidentally click one of these tabs up here. So by default you're in the layout, but there's also a modeling tab, sculpting, UV editing, texture paint, shading, animation, rendering, compositing. I mean, these are all windows you can customize at your leisure, but the default screen usually is what we'll want. So I'll just start a new Blender file, get back to the default. Because this screen is good because it is basically everything you'll need in one. You've got a timeline down here. This is for tracking animation keyframes in the scene. Over here we've got the properties window. So all these tabs will be relevant in their own ways as we get into the modeling part of the training. Top right, we've got the outline view. This will give you a text-based outline of every object you've got in the scene currently. So we've got a cube, a light, and a camera. We don't really need the camera because we're not going to be taking pictures at the moment. The light, I usually just leave it, but we won't need it at first, so we can get rid of it. One thing I would suggest you do is up here, we've got this new system called collections in Blender. And sometimes it can cause problems when you're exporting models for the use in Crowbar. Usually I just drag any items that are in them out of them, get rid of the collection, and you'll see why that's necessary later. I'll go back through that once we have the tools installed. So default Blender file is what we have open right now. So now to install the Blender source tools, we'll go up here, edit bar. We'll go down to preferences. That should open this screen here. So what we have here is basically a list of all the add-ons that come pre-installed with Blender. The ones that have white checks are the ones that are currently enabled, and the ones that are blank are not enabled. Now this is only relevant if you have a bunch of add-ons that you're going to install yourself. But it's worth noting because when we actually install the file that we've downloaded, it'll appear on this list, and you can see that it's checked off and working. So up here in the top right, there's this button called Install. So you click on that, and we'll go and navigate to wherever we save that zip file. So you can see Blender Source Tools 3.03. And then we've got Install Add-on down here in blue. So you'll just click on that. You can see down here down there in that bottom bar it said installed module. So if you just want to see the ones that are enabled, there should be a checkbox up here. So now you can see all the add-ons you have installed and enabled. So you can see right here, I've got the Blender source tools. It's checked off and ready to go. And another way you could check that, so if you go to File, Import, you'll see Source Engine is now here at the bottom of the list. .smd, .vta, .dmx, .qc. And the same thing with the Export tab. So you can see here by default, it's asking me to export an entire collection. But usually a collection will have multiple objects in it, like the camera, the cube, and the light. So that's why I usually drag items out of the collection. Because now, whatever you have selected will be what you're exporting. Or in this case, the only valid object in the scene, which is the cube, because we can't export cameras and lights to a .smd file. Alright, so we've got the Blender source tools installed and we have Blender open. So now the question is, what do we want to make? What kind of a prop do we want to make? By default, making a cube would be kind of simple, but I think we can get a little more ambitious with it. If this is your first time using a modeling program, we'll just get used to the controls real quick. If you have a numpad on your computer, it's very useful. The one key will give you side or front view, side view is 3, top view is 7, and then the 4 and 6 keys can rotate around various perspectives. 5 key will toggle between orthogonal and perspective views. So if you don't know what that means, I suggest you just look it up. But basically, perspective is how the human eye would perceive things, where the further away an object is, the smaller it is. If you're looking at something in orthogonal view, it's more like an isometric perspective, where even if an object is further away from another, it will still maintain its relative scale in relation to the rest of the object on screen. So by default, I have right-click to select enabled, just because I use Blender a lot and that's just what I'm used to. So keep that in mind if I tell you how to do any controls later on down in the tutorial. Another good things to know, the T key will toggle that toolbar on the top left. The N key will toggle this sort of object information panel. For our purposes, we just care about this first one, which is the transforms. Although it'll also tell you whatever tool you're currently using. You can go to the View tab and adjust the 3D cursor and various clip plane stuff. Alright, so basics of what you'll need to make a prop in Source. With the exception of a static prop, you'll always want a generic armature, or a single bone, as the case may be, to be considered the root of the object. So right now in the scene we've got a cube, a camera, and a light. We can select, and then the X key is a good shortcut to remember. This will allow you, it'll ask you if you want to delete an object. So that's a quick way of getting rid of things in the scene. You can select any object in the scene from the outliner in the top right here. But you can also just right click on it if you can see it. So we got the camera gone. Let's delete the collection because we don't need it. We'll use the scene collection. That's just basically just an overview of everything that's in the file. While we're here, before we go any further, you'll see over here on the right side this properties menu. If you have an object selected, it'll usually default to this first orange one. If you deselect, we'll go over to this tab here, Scene Properties. So this is where all your information for the source engine stuff will be. What we really care about here is the source engine export, the exportable files, and the any compiles that are in the file path. So you see how this path here is red. You'll want to define a place where our file will eventually be exported to. So I'm going to do that now. Just make a new folder. If you type if you type into the directory listing in the top a new name or name of a folder that doesn't exist, it will create it. So I'm just going to title this my new model. Hit accept. So that's all good. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to use SMD files and not DMX files. It's because it's what I'm most familiar with, and chances are if you decompile anything out there, that's what you're going to be handling. And from there, we're good. You can just leave everything else as it is. All right, so we've got a cube. A cube is a good place to start, at least just so you can maintain your bearings when you're viewing the scene, because if you get upside down and backwards, it can get a little confusing. How I usually manipulate the scene is I'll use middle click to pan around. If you hold the shift key and middle click, that'll give you sort of side to side, up and down motion. So that just using these two key combinations, you can get a lot of good perspective on any object you're creating. Mouse wheel up and down is good for zooming. Another good hotkey is the numpad period. Any object you have selected, it will zoom in and focus on it so it fills your screen. It's good if you have a large collection of objects in a scene and you're getting lost, or for whatever reason the zoom function is maxing out and it won't let you go in any further. You can always hit the period key and it'll get you back to where you need to be. Aside from that, the plus and minus keys on your numpad will zoom in and out. As I said, the 5 key will toggle between orthogonal and perspective. It's going to be useful if you're trying to make sure something looks perfect but it's not on an axis. Just using the 4, 8, 6, and 2 keys on the numpad, you can rotate around in a scene. And again, if you hold the shift key and hit those buttons, it'll do alternate functions. Control key with 8 and 2, 4 and 6 will translate. Alright, so now I'll try and introduce you to the mode systems. By default in Blender, any object you interact with will have various modes, and you can see this is listed way up here in the top, this tiny little box here. Whenever you have an object selected, you can hit the tab key to switch to whatever its default secondary mode is. But up here in this listing, you can see there's usually a variety. So in this case, because we're dealing with a standard mesh, there's the object mode, the edit mode. Edit mode lets you handle the faces, edges, and vertices by themselves. Sculpt mode is more of like a painting, or interacting with the mesh in the terms of using brushes rather than dragging individual vertices or groups of objects. Vertex paint is usually used for some more interesting visual effects. It's not usually used in Source so much, so we can usually avoid that. Weight painting is for skeletal animation and, to a certain degree, dynamic props and physics props and ragdolls, but we'll address that once we get to that later. And then texture paint is essentially how you can paint onto a mesh using Blender. For right now, all we need to worry about is object mode and edit mode. So in object mode, you can move an object around, but you can't edit the individual faces this way. Basically, you're taking the whole statue wherever you're moving it. You can scale it up and down. But an important thing to remember when you're creating any kind of mesh or prop or whatever for source is that you want all of these transforms over here on the right to be basically at true zero origin. Just for when you export, it can cause complications if it's off axis by a certain number, and then whatever your armature is at a different number. So that's why I always keep this little dialog box open to make sure everything is squared away. Because when you're going to manipulate an object, you want to do it in edit mode, not in object mode. So, that being said, we'll start with the bare necessities. We need to add an armature. This will be used as the root bone that will assign all of the vertexes to. So if you come up to here, there's an add button. So we'll see this armature right here. Now you won't see anything because the armature is currently inside the cube. So if you go over to here while you've got the armature selected, and then you go to viewport display, you can check off this little box in front. So this will make sure that whatever skeleton you have will always be rendered on top of the other things in the scene. And another thing to always remember, the transforms. By default, whenever you add an object in Blender, it will add it wherever the 3D cursor is. So if I left click on the scene, you can see this little crosshair here. So when I added that armature, it ended up somewhere not where I wanted it to be. So by default, you can hit Alt-G. That'll delete any or overwrite any transform and send it back to the origin. So now that the bone is on the screen, you can see it's a little hard to, or a little weird to look at, but essentially you can see the bone through the geometry no matter where it is. If you turn that off, this in front parameter, then you can see it's an actual 3D object that you wouldn't be able to see unless you were inside the object. So I usually leave that on. So we've got our armature. An armature is basically a collection of, I guess you could call them vectors. You've got an X, Y, and a Z, and the secondary point is the forward direction. Most models will use them. The static props are the exception because when you compile a map, static props will all just kind of fuse together and be part of the world geometry. But anything else assumes that it's going to be interacted with in some way, so it needs to have a bone so that the object can be kept track of by the game engine more easily. So now that we've got this armature, another weird kind of sort of quirk of the source engine is that we want the cube to be referencing the armature as a modifier. By default, just moving the bone will not move the object. So what we have to do with the cube selected is go down to this little blue wrench here. So right now there are no modifiers. What we'll do is we'll click on this and we'll add a deform modifier called the Armature modifier. What we're doing here is telling that we're telling the Blender editor that this cube is going to be influenced by this bone we've just created. So in this little box here, you can either click on it and there's only one armature in the scene, or if you have multiple, that you can use the eyedropper. When you hover over this bone in the scene, you'll see that it's saying object armature, so that'll just work. We can leave everything else as it is, because what we need to do with the cube now, if we click on the armature, we can see, okay, we're dragging the bone around. By the way, the G key, I call it, it's basically a grab button. It'll let you move things around with relation to whatever perspective you're in. So if you have an object selected, you hit G, it'll just let you move it around. So as we can see, even though we've added this armature modifier, nothing's changed, right? If I move the cube, nothing happens. If I move the bone, nothing happens. So this is kind of a more esoteric concept with 3D modeling. In theory, we could just make this cube a child or have a child-parent relationship with the armature, which is normally what you do. But for more complex objects like ragdolls, that's kind of simplistic and it won't work. So what we need to do is first we got to click on this armature and figure out what this bone is named. There's a couple of ways of doing this. You can either go up to object mode, set to edit mode, then click on the bone again. Then over here there's this little green bone button. So if we click on that, we can see that this is the default name of this bone. Capital B-O-N-E. I say capital B because everything in most editors now is case sensitive. So it's important to remember that when you're making vertex groups or doing weight painting or editing bones, to always remember that everything's case sensitive. Another way we can make this a little easier on us with more complex objects is that if we go back to this armature tab here, just like where we click this in front button, there's also a show names option. So now we can see in the scene there's a little text here where it just says the name of the bone right over it. Alright, so now we know what the name of the bone is. Now we need to click on the cube object, and we'll click on this little green triangle. It says it's object data properties. So this is where a lot of information you'll access is. Vertex groups are important because it's how you determine which bone influences which part of the model. Shape keys are important if you're creating a character because that allows you to add facial animation and flexes and that sort of thing. UV maps. Although Source doesn't support multiple UV maps, there's some tricks you can do with UV maps that makes editing old models a little bit easier, splitting things out. We don't usually use vertex colors, face maps, attributes, normals, texture space, not that crazy. But the top ones here are important to get familiar with. Since we have a default cube in the scene, we are already given a UV map. So that'll come into play later too. For now, we're just worried about the vertex groups. So as you can see over here in this empty space, there are no vertex groups currently. This is why the modifier isn't doing anything. We don't know which vertices are supposed to go to which bone. So what we'll do over here is we'll add a new vertex group. Now you can see by default it's given it a default name just called group. So what we'll do here is we'll double click, backspace, type in the word BONE. So now you'll see still nothing has changed. What we actually have to do is go into edit mode. So we click on the cube, go to edit mode. You'll know everything on the cube is selected if it's orange like this. If you hit the A key, you'll deselect or select all. You can see I'm selecting all, deselecting all. This is with nothing selected. It'll be a middle gray like this. We hit A, everything is selected now. Now that we're in edit mode, you can see that this box over here has changed to add a few more buttons here at the bottom. So what we're most concerned with right now is making sure that all of this mesh is assigned to this bone group or vertex group. Now we've got an assign button here and a weight slider. Since we're going to make a physics prop first, don't worry about adjusting the weight, just keep it at 1. We've got all the vertices selected because we hit the A key, so now we'll just hit the assign button. Now if we deselect everything again, we can go over here and make sure what we did went through and hit this select button. So basically we're asking the machine to show us all the vertices that are currently assigned to the bone vertex group. The whole model lit up so we know it went through properly. So now we can go back to object mode, and now we should be able to drag the bone around. Oh, something didn't go through right. This is because we do not have this in pose mode. By default, if you want an object to follow an armature, it has to be a child of that unless you're doing it in pose mode. So if we change this to pose mode, now you can see that the object is following the bone, but it's not going to follow it in object mode. Usually when we're making a model in Source Engine, we won't have this sort of ships in the night perspective up here where the two objects are separate. What we'll do normally is that every part of a mesh, every part of a character, every part of an object you're creating will be a child of that base skeleton armature. So if we click on the cube, we'll go down here to this orange button here. And now there's a relations tab here. If we click this open, you can see that there's this little parent column here. So we'll click on that and hit armature. So now up in the outliner, you can see that the cube disappeared. But it's not actually gone, it's just under the header of the armature now. So if you click on this little arrow, you can see now that we've got the pose, the armature, and the cube is now underneath the armature. So now, even in object mode, when we drag the armature around, the cube will follow it. But if we also go to pose mode, the cube will follow the bone. Now, this is essentially all you need to export a model and make it a physics prop. But we'll go a little bit deeper here and try and make something a little more artistic. Generally, the easiest way to make edits is to do it incrementally, iteratively. You don't necessarily have to follow my workflow. There's plenty of Blender tutorials out there, but I'll try and narrate what I'm doing as I go. So I'm going to switch over to edit mode, and rather than having this be just a regular cube, I'm going to make it, let's see. Oh, we could try and make it like a crate. We'll make it a little more detailed than just a box. So, good thing to know is that when you're in edit mode, you could add new objects just like you can in object mode, but they will still be considered a part of this main cube mesh that we have. So we can add planes, cubes, these primitives. And we can also generate more complex meshes using modifiers and stuff like that. For now, we're just going to make something out of cubes. What I'm going to do is select all. I'm going to scale with the S key, and then I'm going to scale just on the Z axis. You can hit the Z key on your keyboard. So now you see this blue line has appeared, indicating that you're just scaling on the Z axis. You can also do a Shift Z and scale on all the axes but the Z. But for now, I just want Z. So I'm going to make this thinner, and I'm going to make it kind of like a wooden plank. So I'm going to scale on the X. So now I'm going to G to grab, and then I'm going to G to grab just on the X axis. I'm going to translate it over a little bit. So now I can do a Shift D to duplicate what I've just made. And you can see it's inside whatever I just had. If you right click or left click after duplicating something, it'll just be wherever it was. And you can also Control Z in edit mode. So I'll Control D. So I've got this new object. And then I can just hit the X key, so it'll translate only on the X axis. And then I'll do it again. Now, if you ever want to select an object without having to go through all the particular pieces, you can select a mesh. You can just click on one of the vertices. You can see that this is highlighted now. Then there's a Control L. You'll select everything that is physically or connected to that first thing that you grabbed. So that's a good way of keeping track of discrete meshes in your object, provided you haven't connected them in some strange way. So I'm going to make these planks a little closer together. I'm going to grab with it and then translate on the X. I'm going to select all. Control D again on the Z axis this time. I'm going to rotate with the R key on the Z axis. I'm going to type 90 for 90 degrees. Now, because we were editing a mesh that we already assigned to a vertex group, if we go back out into object mode, this whole thing will still follow the bone in pose mode. But if you add new meshes with edit mode, like a cube, it will not be a part of that default vertex group. So you have to always remember to assign everything to that group when you're done making changes. Alright, so we got 6 planks here. We'll select all. Now, these orthogonal viewpoints that you can snap to with the numpad are helpful because if you do any kind of operation like rotation or translation when you're in this view, it will restrict it to whatever your perspective is. So I can duplicate, and when I'm grabbing this and moving it around, it's only moving on the X and Z axes that you can see here. So I'm going to grab it up, I'm going to rotate 90 degrees. Now if I move my perspective out, you can see all these changes. Duplicate it again. You can rotate on the y-axis 180 degrees. Duplicate it again, rotate 90 degrees on the y-axis, up, over, Alright. So this is sufficiently complex for our purposes, because what I want to demonstrate here is how to make a collision model. So you can see here that this object, if we were to wrap it with a primitive object, what it would essentially become in the engine is a cube. But there's this big hollow spot in the middle, and things should be able to fall through it. So that's why I've left a hole in the middle. But before we get to that, we'll handle this whole aspect of UV mapping. By default, when you're just creating meshes in Blender, you're not going to be able to texture it very easily because what it generates automatically is okay, but it's not good. You could think of a UV map as like almost like a sewing pattern. We're deciding where to cut up all these faces so that we can put a texture on it. Additionally, we're also going to have to address smoothing groups and edge splits. This object is all made up of sharp edges and hard surfaces, but by default, you do not want to export something that is in flat shaded view. So what we'll do to preview what it's supposed to look like is go up here to Object and then Shade Smooth. So this is what it's got to look like when you export it, or at least this is what it needs to be smooth shaded. What the edge split modifier will do is make it look like it's flat, like before, but it won't cause issues later for us. So what we can do here is in this modifier tab, just like we had the armature, you can add a modifier and then edge split right here. So you can see it's back to the way it looked before. You can toggle between the visualization of this with this little computer desktop icon. So this is how you can confirm that the object is still smooth shaded underneath, but when we export it, this is how it's going to look, because when we export to an SMD, it's going to split up all that geometry for us. If you ever want to, though, you can see that there's this option here called Sharp Edges. So while you're in edit mode, if you go up here and you select, or you can even do it in vertice mode. If you select 2 points, you can see now got this point selected and this point selected. So there's an edge between them now. So if I go up here to the edge options, I can mark sharp. So now you can see this blue line. If I go back out into object view, you can see here right now it's splitting up all this geometry based on an angle value. But if we uncheck this, you can see that it's no longer doing that. We didn't mark enough sharp edges, as you can see, because this still looks like it's rounded on this corner here. So we go back into edit mode. So if you can imagine, these two edges are sharp still, but the ones around the corner and up onto the top are not. So if we go speed this up by switching to edge select, you can select all the objects, hold shift, and you can select multiple edges, then mark as sharp. See, now you can see we're starting to get somewhere. Grab this edge, mark this as sharp. So you can do it manually if you want to, and that's usually what most people will do with more complex things, but for now we can just use this edge angle option because it's smart enough to say, okay, these are all cuboids, 90 degree hard edges are all going to be flat, so you can just leave it at that. UV mapping, on the other hand, is not so automated. So for the purposes of this next part, what I would do is come up here to the top right and drag out another window. So up here now in the top where this little icon is, we'll click on that. Instead of being a 3D viewport, we want to look at the UV editor. So you can see this big box opened up. Same controls apply. Mouse wheel to zoom, middle click to pan and drag. If you hit the numpad keys, you can do various scale factors. So over here, what we do in the 3D view will affect the visualization of the UV editor. So right now we're just in object mode, so it's not going to show us anything. If we go over here and we switch it to edit mode, we select all of our geometry. You can see we've got this kind of Rosario pattern here. What this essentially means is that all of the faces we have on this mesh over here are currently overlapped on each other in the UV map. That can work in certain conditions, but as you can see, these are all squares, and these are mostly rectangles. So whatever we paint on this is going to be incredibly distorted. So what we're going to have to do is come back over here and start marking some edges and then unwrap it again. By default, there's kind of like, like this pattern here is good for cubes because it keeps all the faces on a single object connected, but then you have one UV island. So if you go into edge select mode, we'll just go around and select a couple of edges like this. And if you do Control E, that'll open our edge menu, but you can also access it up at the top there. So I'll mark these as seams. Anything that is marked as a seam will split essentially when you unwrap it. You can tell it's marked as a seam because it'll have this kind of red outline on it. So if we Control L and we just look at these three objects, we can see this hasn't changed over here. But if we go back over to the 3D view, we hit the U key to unwrap. We hit this first option here. We can see that now over here in the UV map, instead of all being on top of each other, it's split it out into 3 separate UV maps, or islands as they're called. But this doesn't look right because this part, which is this part essentially, is fine, but then all this is going to be distorted. Usually what I'll do is up here in this options menu for the UVs, you can show the stretch. Let's see, where is that option? Oh, it's up here in this little blue one. So you can see there's a visualization menu here. Display stretch, this option, check it off. Okay, so blue is good, green is less good. Green means that when you paint or have an image underneath there, it's going to be distorted. Because if you can think about it, a trapezoid is not an easy thing to map a square pixel onto. So we mostly want to have this in the blue. So we're going to have to mark some more edges on these objects over here as seams so that there's less stretch. So I'll start adding some more on the tops here. I'll go down to the bottom here. All right, so now we'll unwrap again with the U key. Okay, it's looking better. Most of this is blue, but it looks like on one of these I missed an edge. So I'll go back through, yep, this one right here. Mark that again. Unwrap. All right, so now this whole thing is blue. That means it's good for whatever artistic ambitions we have later on down the line. So now we just need to keep going through and do this to everything. Worth noting is that when you do an unwrap and you've only got one part selected, it will not keep the rest of the objects in mind when it does the unwrap again. So if I select all the meshes over here, you can see we've got a bunch of stuff overlapping, and that's not going to work. So whenever you do your final unwrap so that you can start moving stuff around on the UV side, just make sure you got everything selected, or there's other things you can do if you have multiple material slots, but we'll address that later on. But for now, what we're going to do, just to preview this, we'll unwrap it again with everything selected. As you can see, it's changed some things, but not everything. Because all of these other objects that we haven't touched yet do not have any seams on them, it's just leaving whatever the default is. Because essentially it's trying to unwrap a 4th dimensional object. There are no seams, right? So inside is outside as far as it's concerned on a 2D plane. So we'll have to go through and mark seams on all of these. Just for the clarity and working through here, you can select anything like these 3 that we're done with. And if you hit the H key, they're not gone and deleted, they're just hidden. So if I hit up here and go back to object mode, you can see they're actually still there. But for the purposes of working through on this model, it'll get it out of your way when you're done with it. So we'll just do a little montage here as I go through and mark seams on the rest of these. Alright, so anything that you've hidden you can unhide with the Alt-H command. So if I select all, hit H, everything's hidden, Alt-H, everything's back. So now that I've got everything marked up and ready to be unwrapped, I'll hit the U key, unwrap. So obviously for a source model it's not very efficient to have each one of these planks have its own separate unique texture. I think at most what we should have is maybe 3 or 4 unique planks. Depends really on what your goals are for your project or what you're trying to do. It's always good to consolidate because it means you can get more image data on the screen with less of a footprint, but you know, perfectly valid to have each plank be unique if you've got spray paint or ambient occlusion effects. Just depends on what you want to do. This could be a little more efficient in how everything is spaced out. You know, I think things are all turned sideways and upside down and can be kind of hard to read. So what we can do here is that just like how we can edit this mesh, we can edit the UV maps. Good thing to keep an eye on here is that by default you'll edit vertices, but you can actually select this option right here, which will allow you to just select entire discrete pieces that are in your map. And just like in the other mode, you can rotate, scale, translate with the G key. So what I'm going to do is consolidate this into a more uniform kind of shape.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Up and down, I think. Start with the one on the right and then turn it up while I'm counting 1.
So we kind of can fit this a little more neatly in here like this. Won't leave much space in between each piece, but that shouldn't be too big of a problem. Just make sure that when you are editing the UV maps that you always make sure that any one of these points is inside the gray grid, because otherwise it'll overlap and start at the other side of the image. Move this up into the corner a little bit. Let's save the file real quick. I'll say my new model. Alright, so now this UV map is acceptable. Our mesh is basically ready to go. One last thing we've got to do before we start is that while we've got this in object mode over here, go down to this little red checkerboard sphere. Usually it'll be given a default material. If there isn't one, you can add one, which I'll demonstrate real quick. This is normally what you'll see if you're don't have a default cube or something. Just hit new. So we're going to change the name of this. This is important because for whatever reason the source engine will interpret the data we export here as its default material. So what we change this name to here is going to have a direct impact on what the name of the default material will have to be when we compile it for the source engine. So I'm just going to call this my new model, because the file is going to be called my new model, material is going to be called my new model, material file, the VMT, will be called my new model. Just keeps everything square. So that's all you got to worry about. None of the parameters or shaders or anything you have underneath this material is going to change anything. All we need to do is make sure that our default material and the faces that it's assigned to are on this here. And just like with the vertex groups, you can check which parts of your model are assigned to a material the same way. So if we switch to edit mode, you can see over here, all of a sudden now we've got the select and deselect options here. So if we deselect, select, you can see that everything that we've got over here is assigned to my new model. This is important because, as you're probably well aware, props, models, ragdolls, anything that you use in the source engine does not strictly need to have one material. You can have multiple. Some faces can be on one material, two material, or a material 2, material 3. You can have pretty much up to 16, I think. I've never really had to go that far, but to each their own. Anyways, we've got our material ready to go. We know this is all square. So we'll go back. And I'm just going to get rid of this UV view because we don't really need it anymore. Drag this over. So I'm going to look at this in pose mode up here. Make sure the whole box moves with it. All right. So right now we're pretty much ready to go for first steps, but first we're going to change some things. Right now this thing is just called the cube up here. Not a very creative name. So if we go to this orange box here, you can change the name of whatever this object is called. So right now it's cube, so I'm going to change it to my new model. So you can see that it was updated up here. Armature is kind of generic as well. Same idea. We'll come down here, change the name. We'll say skeleton. So now this is changed to skeleton, my new model. Now, like I said, we want to make this a physics prop. So we're going to have to make a collision model. One that reflects the fact that there's a hole in the middle here. So what we'll do is we'll add a new object. So we'll go up here. So this collision model is basically going to have to follow a kind of set of rules for it to work properly. So we'll add a new object, new mesh, just add a default cube for now. You can see it spawned on my 3D cursor. I'm going to set all this stuff up here to 0 again. Alright, so the rules with collision models. Each part of the collision model cannot be convex or concave. I always forget which one it is. Essentially, it's got to be solid. You can't have a hole in the middle like we've got here, essentially. So it's got to be a solid volume. So what we can do is we're going to make this collision model out of cubes. Convex, yes, these are convex. Cubes are convex. So we've got this object here, and you can see it's a cube up here. So we'll do what we did before. We're going to change its parent to the armature, which is skeleton now. We'll change the name to my new model physics. So you can see that's up there now. Go down here to materials. We'll give it the same material as the one we just named, my new material. Right? Again, now this is important. If you're making a collision model, it's got to have the smooth shading. We don't need to do edge splits, but we do need to have the smooth shading. Your collision model is always going to look kind of wacky, at least in Blender. So now we've got a cube. So just like before, when you were in edit mode, you can have multiple pieces make up your collision model as long as each individual piece is convex or concave. I always forget which one it is. Concave. Ah, yes. So we want convex objects, not concave objects. If it curves inward, it's not going to like it. So we'll make up our concave physics collision model with convex pieces. So just like before, I'll translate, scale, translate. Right, so that's all good. I'll duplicate it, slide it over here. I'll duplicate it again, slide it into the middle, rotate it. Generally, I try and make sure all the individual pieces of a collision model do not intersect, but it's not necessarily against the system's rules. You can have them intersect if you need to. All right, that looks like a halfway decent collision model. All we've got to do is make sure it's now assigned to the bone just like the default mesh is. So we'll go in to edit mode, make sure everything's selected. So you can see that we got no vertex groups here. Add one, call it bone. And we'll hit the assign button. So now we should be able to go in pose mode on the bone. Something has gone wrong, right? Oh, the modifier, of course. So we go down to this little blue wrench again. Add a modifier, armature. So now, ooh, once again, something has gone wrong. Oh, I didn't specify the object. Skeleton. All these steps are very important. They may alter your results if not followed. So now our collision model and our base model will follow the bone. We're pretty much set to go. We don't have to worry about a UV map for the collision model because you're not going to see it. From here, what we'll do is we'll go, oh, there's one final step. By default, we need to have a sequence for this bone, which is essentially, you can think of that as a default animation. You'll know it has an animation because if you go over here to this scene properties and you do export, then you see the exportables list here. So right now all we're able to export is the model and the collision model, but we also need a default sequence. So even though we have a skeleton in the scene, we don't have a sequence yet. So this is where this timeline down here comes in handy. What we'll do is we'll hit the record button. That's that little light up thing right there. So now any kind of movement, scale, rotation that we do in the scene will be recorded on this frame down here. You can use the arrow keys to manipulate which frame you're on. So what I do just to simplify things is we'll do an Alt-R, which will zero out any rotation, but because I did that, it's given us a keyframe, and you can tell it has because this is all turned yellow. We'll do an Alt-G, so that has reset the translation. So now we have a keyframe for the translation. Alt-S, that just resets the scale, which has given us a keyframe for the scale. And that's all we need. Because as you can see down here, we now have a sequence. Skeleton, action, SMD. If you want, we can go in here. Up here in this tab here where it says animation. Skeleton action, we can rename this to something simpler, like ragdoll. Even though this isn't going to be a ragdoll, I usually name the default pose ragdoll just because that's usually the default sequence in most source engines models. Save it. All right. So this is all we need now. We're ready to go. I would just go through and check in object mode. Make sure all your objects have 0 transforms. You don't need to have animation on the objects themselves, just the bone on the armature while you're in pose mode. So if we go to object, back to pose mode, we can see, yes, this is still all yellow. It's got a little yellow dot down in the timeline. We can turn off the record thing here. Save it. Go back to object mode. So exporting SMDs to our folder. Up axis is going to be Z because that's what it is in Blender. Engine path, target engine, not necessary. We're going to stick with source. You can look through the Blender source tools. You can integrate a lot more into this plugin if you need to. We don't have any vertex animation. This is all good. So what we can do here is hit this export button. So there'll be an option at the top, which is whatever you have selected last, but what we actually want is this scene export. All 3 files. That'll be all of these 3 files down here. So click that. You'll see a little prompt down here at the bottom that says 3 files exported in such and such seconds if everything has gone well. So now we can save this, minimize it. So here's that folder I made. So now what we've got here is the mesh, the physics model, and then it's created a subfolder here. Called animations. Click on that. There's our default sequence. All right. So now the fun part. QC files, borderline coding. Not fun. So creating a QC file from scratch may seem like an insurmountable obstacle, but it's actually very easy. All you got to do is make a new text document. And all you got to do is call it, let's say, my new model .qc. So what we'll do, if we go into the properties, yeah, let's see. I always forget how to do this in Windows, but shit, maybe it might be easier to make a new. Let's back up. We'll go backwards. Notepad ++. We will open Notepad++ and make a new file. So what we'll do, we'll save this blank file as, we'll navigate to that no, not missed. Should love Windows. All right, we'll call this compile, and we'll just put a .qc at the end. So now, yep, there it is. Because I've installed Notepad++ and I've got that user-defined language, it can tell that this file needs to be opened by Notepad++. So having that file extension on the end has made sure that when I start typing things in here, like model, see, changes colors, gets highlighted differently. Otherwise, you'll just have to follow along in Notepad and make sure you spell everything correctly. Speaking of which, all right. So we're making this from scratch. So at the top, what we're going to do, we got to define what the model will be called once we compile it. So model name. What will the name of the model be in the directory? We'll say my new model.mdl. And I will have this open up here. Stream zoom so everyone can see. All right. So we know what the model will eventually be called. Now we need to specify what file we're going to use. My new model.smd. So what we'll do is we'll type body with a $ in front of it. We'll say this default mesh is going to be called body or base. And then we'll say this is my new model.smd, end quote. So if we look in our folder, that's what we named it. So now we got to figure out what is it going to be made out of. We'll do $ surface prop in quotations wood. So this will make sure that when you hit it with bullets or impacts or yada yada yada, it'll make wood sound effects and have wood VFX that sprays out of it. Where now we're going to specify where can we find the material in the directory. So just like an old command line prompt, we'll change directory, cd, and then materials, and then in quotes. By default, anytime I make a model, I'm going to put the materials in the subfolder for models. So we'll say models / my new model / end quote. Now we need to specify the default sequence, which is that sequence we made with the timeline tool. So you can actually specify subdirectories with your individual files as well. So we'll do sequence default anims / and what did we call this? Ragdoll.smd. And then we got to specify what collision model we're going to use because we want this to be a prop physics. So $ collision model, and then open quote my new model _ physics. Now, collision model has some additional parameters that we can specify. We'll do an open curly bracket, and then $ mass. Anything under 35 kilograms, which is what we use as our measurement, can be picked up by the player. So we'll set this to 25. Now, important to note here, because our collision model was made up of multiple cubes, we have to specify that we want it to consider each part separate. So we'll type a $ concave. Otherwise, it'll say, okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 cubes. Let's make a big hole that wraps around all of them. And that's not what we want. Then we'll hit enter, close brace. And that should be all we need, at least at this stage. So now what we want to do is we're going to open up Crowbar. We can leave this open for now, just in case we run into any problems. Crowbar. All right, this will probably be what you see when you first launch this application. This is important, and it really depends on what engine you're making files for, but as a default, I'm going to go with Gary's mod because it's pretty popular. Everyone's pretty much got it. You'll see over here, this is the drop down. We've selected Gary's mod. This is the name. This is the engine. If these are not filled in, we can navigate to them. So the executable file, if we hit browse, this is in the Steam Apps Common Gary's mod folder. So we're looking for Half-Life 2. And up here, the game info. This will let us know where all the textures and stuff we're looking for are. That'll be in the subfolder for Gary's mod, not where the executable is, but one down from that. So you can see right here, game info text. Now, these are the more esoteric ones. Model compiler. So most source engine games will have a bin folder. So we're not looking in the actual Gary's Mod folder here, but the bin folder under Gary's Mod. This is where all the tools are stored, like Hammer, VViz, VRED, all that stuff. So we'll click on the bin. It knows it's looking for studio models, so just double click on that. Half-Life Model Viewer. Very important. Certain Half-Life model viewers will not be able to view your model if it's a certain format or a certain version type. So make sure you select the one that is for your model compiler. Mapping tool we don't really care about, but you can navigate to Hammer. We're not going to use the packing tool. This is all we need for now. So now up here on this top list of tabs, what we're going to do is going to go to compile. So now this file right here is what we're looking for. We'll go to my new file. So that you can see this is the file we just saved over here on the right. So we'll click on that. Up here it's going to ask you if you want to output it to the games model folder or the subfolder of the folder it's already in, the QC file. Usually I'll select the game folder, that way I can test it right away. And then we're going to change the game that has the model compiler to Gary's Mod. There we go. Now you don't need P4 because we do not have it. I usually check off verbose so that I can see if there's any problems with the file. Aside from that, that's all you need. We'll just hit the compile. So if we were to interpret this for a moment, zoom in on the text here, scroll up, because being able to decipher this this output log is very important if you run into errors. So as you can see, we started output from compiler. This is the directory, game path, compile, building binary model files working. So it loaded our new model, our ragdoll, our physics, processing LOD for material. So it's warning us that we have two-dimensional geometry that's less than ½ inch thick on some axis. Usually not a problem. So as you can see here, it says we have an error with our convex elements of my new model. So it did not like our collision model. So you can scroll down, everything else seems to be fine. So we ran into an error, but we're going to look at it with this button here, use in view. So this is a separate tab up here on the top. So we've got compile, view. So it's loaded our model in. So now we can hit this button here. All right, so it won't have a material, but we can see that it did load in just fine. Check off the physics model, we can see, oh, like I said, it's going to draw a big cube around everything because it encountered some problem with our collision model. Our model is a little small, kind of pathetically small actually. This is another thing you got to remember when you're working with Blender. So if you look over here in this tab, the one that pops up when you hit the N key. Right now our object is only 2 units wide, and by 2 I mean literally 2, like in Hammer units. 2 units, 2 inches essentially. So what we can do here, and this is good to know even for your own uses later on down the line. I know that earlier I told you never to scale or rotate in object mode, but it can be useful in situations like this. So this thing is only 2 units by 2 units. What we probably want is something closer to like 40 or 50. So what I'll do is I'll scale it by 25. So our physics model is 25 times bigger, and then I'll scale the mesh underneath 25 times. So you can see up here we've got scale 25, scale 25. We don't need to change the bone at all because it's just going to do whatever it does for us. But now that we've got these scaled up, what we can do is go up to Object, Apply, All Transforms. So now this is what the 1.0 scale will just look like. And we'll go into the other mesh and do the same thing. All right. So now we'll export everything again. We'll compile everything again. Ah, here we go. I was confused why it was telling me the thing was too small, and it was too small. So, processed all our models, found the LOD, 4 convex subparts, collision model completed. Found one pre-existing sequence, that's our idle pose. You can see we've got no flexes, no eyeballs, no inverse kinematics really. I think that's just pose data right there. It's telling us the volume of the collision model. Generates each of our discrete files. Everything's compiled and complete. We'll use in view. Our half-life model viewer should already be open, so we'll F5 it, and there we have it. This is our physics model is correct, and you can always check that with this little button tab down here. Obviously there is no material assigned, but we have yet to make a texture for it, so that's what I'll show you next real quick in probably in Substance Painter, and then I'll make some changes in Photoshop to really give you a deep dive on how you can use Substance Painter for your own benefit. If you don't have access to a program like Substance Painter, another good place to start is this website called textures.com. You can either pay for or have a free account, and it gives you these various little points you can spend every day on various textures and stuff at certain resolutions, and you can search for, like in our case, wood. And they'll give you stuff like this with the spheres is all for 3D physically based rendering stuff. They also used to have some more basic just flat textures like this. These are all available at various resolutions. You click in on one, it'll give you some pricing skews. So usually every texture you can find on this website will have a low-res free version that you can buy with those free credits you get for signing up. And since we're working in the source engine, you're probably not going to need 8K or 20K textures to make a decent looking box or character. So this is a good resource if you're not able to use technology like the Substance Painter, and all you've got is what's available out there on the internet, and you can accomplish some decent results. I mean, this is a car I made a while ago using the traditional opening it in Photoshop and moving textures around method. I think I've got some other similar results with another one here. These are based on vehicles from a Mad Max Fury Road. So I might revisit these one days with Substance Painter at my disposal, but suffice it to say that if you don't have Substance Painter, you can still get some pretty decent results doing things by hand. So unfortunately, I will not be showcasing such a thing in this video because it is sort of a separate medium, something you'll have to get adept at doing yourself. Before we continue, I'll show you how to generate ambient occlusion maps in Blender and export what you've done with the UV map so that you can author something in Photoshop by hand if need be. So, just like before, like I said, we're not going to need to see the phys model. So you can see up here in the outliner, you've got these little eyeballs and the little camera thing. So we can toggle the visibility of certain objects with this eye. So we know the physics model is good to go, the scale is good now on everything. So what we'll do is we'll click here on the mesh, the artistic part of the mesh. And this is kind of where the nuance of Blender comes in. What we'll want to do is go up here to on the little camera. We're going to change the render engine from Eevee to Cycles. Essentially what this is going to let us do is ray trace certain things or bake certain textures to a file. What we'll do down here is we'll get rid of the timeline and change this to the UV image editor. And then what I'll do now is I'll go up to this top right, drag out another UV image editor. And instead of a UV editor, we'll change this to a shader editor. So the shader editor is kind of like a node box. It'll show you whatever the current shader applied to this material is. So you remember how earlier we added this material down here. So this information will be displayed in a simplified form over here. So our material is called My New Model. Right now it's using a principled shader. What we'll do is we can either click on this, or it's a little easier if we click here. I'm going to change this to a diffuse BSDF shader. So as you can see, it's kind of simplified things over here in the node editor. And just like in every other window, you can zoom, middle mouse to drag, move around, zoom. Even the numpad period will work if you have something selected. So just like before, if we go into edit mode, we can see we've got our UV map over here, but we don't have an image yet. So what we're going to want to do is, you can see that there's this little new button here. We're going to make a new texture. We'll title this ambient. And the default resolution is fine. Usually I'll just uncheck the alpha, because we don't need an alpha channel, because it's going to be a black and white texture. So now you'll see the UV map is being projected on top of that black image we just generated. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to this node editor and socket in this image we just made into the color channel. It's not, or I mean, it's not necessary that we do that. As long as we have the image here, we're good. So just like in the other editors, you can add, and then we'll do input, or no, texture, image texture. So this will be a little box that we can drag around and click to place it. So just like how we had a new and open, now we have a new and open on this. But if we click on this little image here, we can select an image that's already been made is in Blender right now. So we saved this image, or titled it ambient, so we'll click on that. So we don't necessarily have to drag this color node over. We can just leave it like this. As long as we have it highlighted with that little white line going around it, we're ready to go. So now what we'll do is we'll exit edit mode. Another important thing to do when you're rendering any kind of texture that has lighting interactions. So that collision model we made earlier is technically in the scene around our cube right now. So I toggled the visibility, but what I didn't do is toggle the rendering of it. So we'll toggle it for renders and visibility. And just for good measure, I'm going to click on the physics model that's been hidden. I'm going to go to this little orange option, and then down here where it says visibility, I will not show it in, it's not show it, yeah, see, it's not being shown in renders right now. So that's good. If we click on this, our current model, you can see it is being shown in renders. So that just is a good way to double check. So now what we'll do is that we've got this texture selected, go up here to this little camera option, and then we'll ignore all of this. We don't need any of that. So we'll look for this option called bake. So right now, if we were to hit the bake button, it would bake everything. So colors, lighting, scene information, reflections, or at least in this case, since it's a diffuse shader, we would get some direct lighting, and maybe some bounce lighting if there were any bounces going on. But what we don't want is combined. What we want is ambient occlusion. So pretty much you should be ready to go. We'll just hit the button here. Now you'll see this little progress bar appear down here. So the machine is doing something. You just got to keep an eye on that percentage bar. So this may take a long time depending on what you've set the sampling limit to. So now that my computer's just finished it, you can see it's updated the image here in the bottom left. There's black and white spots. White is essentially there's nothing occluding it, there's no nearby anything. Black means it's right next to something, so it's adding shadows. And if we want to preview this, we could take the image now that we've generated over here, and then drag this little color node into the diffuse slot. So now nothing has changed, but if you go back to the viewport, we go up here to the top right, you see where the we've got this little wireframe view, solid view, then we can do material preview or shader preview. So now we can see what our texture looks like. So even though there's a bunch of black spots on here, they're in places where you can't really see it because it's where the geometry is getting close together. You can see the little shadows underneath here. So that's what generating ambient occlusion does. It gives you a rasterized version of essentially shadows that won't change depending on the lighting conditions. So now that we have this image, we can either save it or adjust the parameters. If you've noticed, if you're doing this on a laptop or something that's not as powerful, or maybe you just want to make adjustments as you go, you can lower the samples that we use to generate it. So right now it's set to noise threshold. So we could turn off denoise, we'll turn off the noise threshold, and we'll set the sample limit to 2. Then we'll hit bake again and see what it does. So now, essentially what you're sampling here, or what the samples is doing, is it's saying, okay, we're going to run this operation maybe like it was set to until the noise is reduced to a certain degree. Or we can say, oh, we're just going to run it for a set amount of samples. So 2 samples isn't very much. You can see all this noise has suddenly appeared, and there's black and white dots all over the texture we generated. So essentially, you could think of this as like iterative. It's averaging it. It's firing or generating the image using a random input tens to hundreds of times, and then it's averaging it across all those images. So if we set the samples now to 24, bake it again. So you can see now our noise has been reduced. There's still a little bit here and there. And depending on what kind of art style you're going with, you may actually want that kind of noise on your ambient occlusion. Just because it adds a little bit of, it makes the model look less clean in the final result, but that can be something you can add in Photoshop later. But I think the default is good nowadays. Leave it at 4096, have it denoise, and have the noise threshold enabled. Just one-stop shop. It'll be slow at first because what it's thinking is, okay, I'm going to run this 4,000 times. But once it hits a point where it realizes there is no more noise being generated, it's just going to stop right there and spit the image out. So that's how we get these mostly clean-looking image down here. If we turn off the noise threshold and the denoiser, we can see what it would look like with a full render if it doesn't take too long. So now you can see that percentage bar down there is going a lot slower because it's not stopping once it's hit its limit. It's going to say, okay, we're going to keep going, keep going. So really dial it in. And if at any time you want to just cancel this render, that's why this little X button is here down here. Just click on that. It'll take a few seconds, but hey, look at the image now. Even though we had the denoiser on earlier, the image we've generated now actually looks a lot smoother than the one that it gave us with the denoising algorithm and the noise threshold. So it is important to do some trial and error here and dial in to settings that you prefer, especially if the goal is to have something really clean that you can use as like a mask in Photoshop or something like that. So what I'll do now is that now that we've got an image that we're happy with, go over here to this image tab, save as, and then we'll go down to the my new model folder, and we'll save that as ambient occlusion. Always keep an eye on this up here. We don't want to compress this because it's not the final image. It's not what we're going to be putting into the source engine. And you can adjust that in one of the scene tabs over here too. If we go, if we click on the, what is this called? Object or output properties, you can see down here in this output channel, can set the compression to 0, set the default to RBG or RGB because we're not using alpha. Alright, so now we have an ambient occlusion map. What we now want is a UV map that we can use. So what we'll do is we'll switch over to edit mode on the object view. We can do this in the default shading. And then now you can see our image is still there, but it's being overlain with all the actual UV image data. So if we select all, you can see that the image that we generated actually padded the pixels around the edge of our UV map for us automatically. And that's another setting you can adjust over here in the Bake tab. Down here you see this little margin. So it's trying to give us 16 pixels on each edge, or off of each of the edges and points here, so that when you're further away, or if the image is shrunk, it's gonna have a bleed, so it doesn't make the seams that noticeable. So now that we have this UV, or the object is in edit mode, we have all the vertices selected. We can go over here to this little UV button. And all the way at the bottom, we've got this option called Export UV Layout. So we'll click on that. You can see over here on the right, it's giving us resolution options and opacity options. Usually I set the opacity to 1 because we're not going to actually use this in the authoring of the texture, but it'll give us a good idea of where all the pieces are. And you can always check off all UVs if you haven't actually selected everything. It'll make sure they're all in there. So we'll export this to the My New Model folder too. All right. So now what you can do, we'll save this. Now we'll open Photoshop. Just to get things ready to go, what we'll do is go to the My New Model folder. So this is some stuff from later for the Substance Painter portion. But what we're going to want to open here is the ambient occlusion, or we'll open the UV map. So this is a good place to start, and then we have the ambient occlusion we generated in Blender. We'll put that in as another layer. So we'll put the UV on top. We'll have the ambient be a multiply layer, and then we'll start a new one down here. We'll adjust the opacity of the UV layer. So now we're just off to the races, and this is where you can start painting underneath, and you can change the colors and get some reference textures from textures.com or something and lay them in, get all the pieces you want and the places you want. And then just toggle off that UV map at the end, and then export this to a PNG file. But this is good to go. We can check the ground, so whenever we spawn this in an engine, it's going to be kind of like in this configuration. Generally, you don't want it to be clipping with the ground, but we can always make adjustments to that later. Alright, so for those of you who do not have Substance Painter or have no interest in using Substance Painter, you can skip ahead now. But what I will do is we'll hide the physics model, and I will export this file as a .fpx to my new model folder. I'm going to change the name to subs, and then over here I'm just going to use the selected object because I don't need the bone or anything else. It's hard to appreciate the versatility and the use of something like Substance Painter until you've made a few models yourself and done it the old-fashioned way. Really, it's almost like it is the ideological equivalent of a Photoshop for three-dimensional objects, because whatever precision you're losing by interacting with a 3D object, you gain so much more by the various options it gives you. Which I'll try and demonstrate here with this very basic object. device. Take a look at this. Is about what it'll look like when we export it, but we can make use of the roughness and metallic maps in other ways. Normal map doesn't have much right now, but once we export the textures, it should look slightly different. All right, save that. Okay. So we'll go back to our folder. We've got a base texture, we've got a height map, we've got our normal map, and a roughness map. So now we'll go back, and this is where the thing I was telling you about Photoshop will come in handy. We can make use of some of this stuff. So what we want to do is take the normal map, add an alpha channel. What we'll do is we'll use the roughness map as the alpha channel. Adjust the contrast a little bit. So now when I go to save this or export it again, I've got this new option for Super PNG. I'll just save that as a copy. So now you can see this little dialog that shows up, it's going to use this new channel as the alpha. So even in the Windows preview, you can see it looks slightly different. But what we actually want to do here invert what we've got from the roughness channel because source handles it slightly different. And then we'll save it as a copy again. There we go. It should look faint like that. Then can't really do much with the height map, but maybe we'll try some stuff later. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the base color. I'm going to take the ambient occlusion map, put it on a new layer, make it multiply. We're not going to do full opacity. Now down a little bit. Let's save it as a copy. It's fine as a regular PNG. Okay. All right, so now this is where our little VTFEdit program comes into play. So we go back into Crowbar, we go back into View Our Model. You can see we got these purple and black textures. If we click on the Model tab here, it's going to say, okay, I'm looking for a VMT and I can't find it. So what we need to do is open VTFEdit. You'll get a prompt kind of like this. It'll be a gray box. So VTFEdit is kind of a combination between an image conversion software and also a text editor because it edits both the VTF files and VMT files, which we use to make the material and import the texture that makes up the material. So we'll do File, Import, go to My New Model. We'll start with the base color copy we just made. All right. Allow me to explain what these normal and alpha texture type formats really do. So there seems to be a tendency to stick with DXT5 for most things, but the truth is that you don't really need it unless there's an alpha channel. The only difference you will notice between any of the DXT compressions is that the only thing they handle differently across them is how they handle alpha, or the alpha channel. So DXT1, DirectX texture format 1, essentially. No alpha, right? If you need alpha, and it's basically a question of which one after that. But if you're like in this instance, we're using a base texture, so we can use DXT1, which will save us from having to even consider the alpha channel. DXT1 with 1-bit alpha basically means that you can have binary alpha in your alpha channel. Either it's on or it's off. DXT3 will have essentially more color variation in the alpha channel, but it's still pretty limited. And then DXT5 has an even greater expansion of how many different shades of alpha you can have. But again, it's still limited. So essentially, you're basically going to use DXT for anything that's the base texture. If you want an uncompressed texture, you'll usually use the BGR-A or the BGR-888 variations. And these ones essentially are just saying we're giving 8 bits to the blue, green, and red channel, or in this BGR-A case, 8 bits to each of the various color channels. We're not going to resize it. We're not going to generate a normal map from it. We will generate MIP maps using the cat-rom filter because, well, I can demonstrate once I hit OK. So it'll take a second. So now we've got our image here. Usually I'll check off sRGB because that's just the color space that most images are saved in. So you can see on these options we've got here, there's this MIP map option that you can actually see what the smaller and smaller texture looks like as it gets lower in quality. Essentially, the filter that you choose, in this case cat-rom, will alter how the resize algorithm will interpret details. I usually just use cat-rom for most things. It's less important nowadays where textures are inflating in size all the time. But now that we have this file imported, we've got this little flag checked off that it's going to be sRGB. We'll save it as. Now this file, or this model that I'm making rather, is in Gary's mod. So we'll go to the directory for Gary's mod. There should be a materials folder. If there isn't one, you can make one. So now what we'll do is we'll go back and check where did we say we were going to have these materials. Okay, so it's going to be in materials, models, and then a folder called my new model. So go back to VTF, we got materials, I've got a models folder, make a new folder, my new model, and we save the material in Blender as my new model. But we'll actually add something to the end here and just say base. Because actually what we care about is not what the VTF file is named, but the VMT file. So we've got our base texture. So now we'll import some of those other files we were using. Get the normal map that we altered. Now, coming back to the formats again. A normal map is vector data stored in color. So what we don't want to do is compress that color data. DXT compression will compress that color data, which will alter the vectors that you get from a normal map, which is undesirable. So instead of using DXT compression, what we'll do is change this to BGR888. But because we have an alpha channel, we'll change it to BGRA8888. And all this means essentially is that each channel, blue, green, red, and alpha, will be given 8 bits per channel. So now once we have this all ready to go, hit OK. So we can see the images here. We'll check off the normal map flag on this little list on the left side. We can actually go up here and view the mask to make sure the alpha transparency was inherited properly. We'll save as. It should remember your directory in the file name path, so instead of having base, I'll change this to normal. And let's see, what else can we use? We can actually use the roughness by itself. So we'll import again. Roughness. Change this back to DXT1. Now, there is a format for black and white textures called I8. Unfortunately, it causes some issues when you use it basically for anything that, like in this case, I'm going to use it as an exponent texture. Because of the way I8 stores its color data, it will not work for our purposes, so we'll still use DXT1 compression. Save this as, and we'll put this down as exponent. Save. All right. So now that we have all this stuff saved, there's a handy little feature of VTFEdit. Go up to here to Tools, Create VMT File. So most recent file will go in the base texture slot, but we don't actually want that one. We'll hit the little dots. Base texture is going to be the base. Bump map will be our normal map. And let's see. We'll just leave it like that. We can type in the rest as we need. We'll go over to options. The shader is not going to be light mapped. What we want is Vertex Lit generic. Don't have to specify the surface, but we'll change it to wood just in case someone wants to use it for something else. Like a brush and hammer, or for whatever. Wood box. We don't really care about the rest of this. Yep, that's all good. We'll create. So now this is the part we care about. The VMT file needs to be named My New Model, because that's what we saved it as in Blender, and that's what we exported it as in Blender. So we'll save. Close this dialog. Now, assuming we've done things right, all we have to do is refresh the model viewer, and our texture will be on the model. So you're not going to notice too crazy stuff going on with the lighting because we don't actually have a lot of the parameters we want in yet. The normal map has been applied because we can check off normal mapping, and you can see there's a slight difference. We have it on versus off. So what we've done by putting an inverted roughness map in the alpha channel of the normal map is allowed for a thing called Fong to be more realistically represented in our final product. So what we'll do is I'll go to the Gary's Mod directory and navigate to that VMT we just created. So this is what it looks like. So now, the thing to remember when you're doing all of these sorts of things is that the Valve Developer Wiki is your friend. I have a lot of bookmarks. Fong I always refer to frequently because I'm always looking up commands for this to try and play around with new effects. This little passage right here is useful just because I'm going to use most of these parameters. So I'm just going to copy that wholesale. Paste that in. Believe it or not, you do not need to have quotation marks around damn near everything in the VMT file. The only thing that needs quotes are the actual parameters themselves that come after each command. So I'll try and zoom in on this for you. It will not change in real time in the model viewer, so there's no sense in actually having it super side by side like that. Alright, so we've got our Fong enabled. We've already got a bump map, so we can get rid of that. So we do not need the Fong exponent because we're going to use that texture we saved. So I'll copy this and I'll paste it here. Change the normal to exponent. Or did I actually save it as exponent? Yes. Okay. Fong boost. For now, we can just change this to the default for now. So we'll save, refresh. You won't immediately notice that much of a change. So what we need to do is just to make it really noticeable. Didn't have normal maps checked off. There we go. Now we can see some glistening wood. Because this is hard surface modeled, sometimes you just have to catch it at the right angle. Unless the normal maps are inverted, but you know, who could say? So we'll go back to VMT, just like that. Alright, so now that we can fine-tune these parameters a little bit. I mean, obviously wood isn't super shiny, so it's not too crazy important, but we will want to adjust it so that it does not look like that when it's directly under a light source. So that's where this Phong Fresnel range comes in handy. Basically, you could think about this as an angle of inflection. The first number is, will it be at full brightness when it is directly facing you? Second value is kind of the in-between point, and the third value is the leading edge. Now, because this is a hard surface prop, we can set this first value pretty low, maybe 0.3. Second value 0.4. We'll ramp up to 0.7. We'll refresh half-life model viewer. So now when you catch the light just at the way edge, you might catch a little bit of reflection, because that's all we really want, just when it's right at an extreme angle. But then when you're directly looking at it, it's not super bright. So we can actually even go even lower. Change this first one to maybe 0.1. Refresh. Yeah, I'd like that. All right, so now that we've done all this, theoretically this model should just be in our Gary's models folder, but I'll double check just in case. Yep, my new model, they're in the directory. So now I just launch Gary's mod and we'll see if it's there. Although, what we can also do is open Hammer. Add a new prop, physics. Change the model and we'll look for my new. All right. On the map. Maybe at some point, Gary's mod with its infinite wisdom will load. Alright. So now if we look at our object, you can see it interacts with the light nicely, makes the right sound effects. And then if we spawn a barrel, should be able to have what? Yep, put a barrel inside the box. And because we set its mass light enough, we can lift it with the use key. Add some light. Kind of get some of those lighting effects I was talking about when you just look at it at the extreme leading edge. Now the reason I'm pimping Substance Painter so hard isn't because I'm some great artist with it, but you saw how quickly I managed to turn out a texture for something like this, and the same applies to metal and flesh and anything else that you can get your hands on. So now that we've gone through the entire process, let's do a quick overview of all of the steps we went through and get them all down as a process. So we open Blender, we make sure we have the source exportable tools installed. Our first step in the process is we take whatever mesh we have in the scene and we edit that. In our case, that was the base cube that we had. We make it whatever shape we want. we smooth shade it. Switch object, shading, where is it? Shade smooth. So then if we want hard edges on it, we go in and edit and add manually and mark edges as sharp, or we can use a modifier called the edge split modifier. Then we add the armature modifier and add a skeleton to the scene, or an armature. We make sure we know what the name of that bone is and change it as we please. Then we add a vertex group to the cube model that we've made, and make sure it's got the same name in our vertex group section as it does on the actual armature. Since we're making a physics prop, we also add another mesh or another cube to the scene and do all of the same steps. We make out of a convex. If we make a concave physics model, then we're going to use convex objects to make it. So in this case, we made 4 cubes and arranged them in a pattern. We make sure that the collision model is smooth shaded and triangulated. We make sure it's got its vertex group assigned the same way as the default mesh. Then on both our base mesh and our physics model, we make sure that it's got a material slot defined. We make sure we know what the name of that material slot is, and we mark it down for later. Then we have to make sure that there's an animation frame on our default bone. So we hit this little record button down here, and we can either move, or we go into pose mode on the armature. We can move the bone, make sure all of these little numbers up here turn yellow, and we can reset the translation. So we can see down here that we have a keyframe, and then we double check it by going over to the exports list and making sure that we've got an action listed here, as well as the 2 meshes that we're going to leave or export. So then at that stage, we've got our we've got the materials defined, we've got the mesh, we've got the collision model, we've got an animation frame, and all of the relationships are set up. And then when we move things in the editor, they behave as they ought to. We export all of the files into a folder of our choosing. So right here we've got all of our materials in our which we can make after this particular step. After you've completed the model, you can do your art pass, make the textures, do all that sort of thing. So then we have to compile the model. So we create a QC file. The bare minimum right here to actually get it to go through, you'd have a model name defined. So we named ours mynewmodel.mdl. An important thing to note here is that if you change this to a directory that isn't just the default one, so like let's say props lab, right? So if you compile this model, it will assume that you're going to put it in this subfolder. So if you actually compile this model and then move it somewhere else, it won't actually work. So you got to make sure that all of the files that get generated when you compile the model are actually going to the subfolder that you've defined here in the QC file. Otherwise, we would have no reason to specify the file path if it could just work anywhere. So it's always important to make sure you remember that when you're compiling models. So then we define what are the base mesh is going to be, which SMD the base mesh is going to be using, and this is what we named it. Define a surface prop so we know what SFX it's going to use. We let it know what directory we're going to look for the VMT file in this case the model subfolder, and then the mynewmodel subfolder. We have our default sequence here. We give it a default name. We can change this to whatever we want. This was the subdirectory in our folder under anims. So this is what we named it. So we specify in that directory anims ragdoll smd. This is our collision model. This is what we named it. We change the mass, add concave because we have it made up of several convex parts. Then we open Crowbar. And then we open, let's see, mynewmodel. So we open our QC file in the compile tab. Make sure we've got the output to set to our games models folder. Although if you're also using it for a mod you're making, you can specify a work folder or subfolder that you can paste it into as well. Make sure that P4 is disabled. And we just hit compile. We can control mouse wheel on this log so we can zoom in and see that everything went through well. I always check see what it did with our collision model. So we know it had 4 pieces and it gave us 4 pieces. Another good thing to check is to make sure that it's outputting all of the separate particulate files that you need. So we've got the VTXs for the DX80, we've got the DX9, and then we'll go, and if there's this handy little button up here, use and view. So now we've got, this is our file path in our game folder. So we can actually browse to that folder if we want, or we can hit this go to button. That'll open a folder. So now we can see down here it's highlighted. Yes, this is my new model. It's in the Gary's Mod Models folder. So we don't necessarily have to look at that, but then we can click down here, click on View. That should open Half-Life Model Viewer, and then our model will just be right there. And then while we're in the model viewer, we can toggle things like the normal mapping to check that our FONG is working from our VMT file that we generated. We can also check to see if the physics model is properly generated and where it should be. Always good to check this because sometimes when you compile a model, your collision model will be twisted or facing the wrong direction, so it's a good thing to double check this before you go testing it in your map or your game. Then from there we started authoring our VMT file. So we used VTFEdit to import our various textures. And then what we can do is I'll open Gary's Mod, Materials, Models, my new model, open the VMT file. So because in this particular case I was using Substance Painter, I had a base texture, a normal map, and an exponent map. If you don't have these things, you can make do with just the base texture. So all this can go, and this is literally all you need. Just make sure that it's set to Vertex Lit Generic because we're using a 3D model here and it's not going to be on a brush. So it's going to be lit by Vertex and not by Lightmap. Then from there, we open Hammer or open the game that we're running and test that it's actually working and how we like it.